He walked off the pitch with spit in his curls and pride in his chest. The cameras caught it. The world saw it. One of the most humiliating moments in World Cup history. Rudi Völler, Germany's tireless striker, standing still as Frank Rijkaard launched a glob of saliva straight into his hair. Twice. In the cauldron of Italia '90, it wasn't just sweat and dirt on his shirt. It was insult. But what few remember is what came before and what came after. Before that disgraceful act, he'd been dismissed by Maradona as a non-threat, a mere workhorse in a world of matadors. And after? He didn't throw punches. He didn't scream. He walked away. Furious, yes, but composed. And then he came back stronger, dragging West Germany to glory. Völler never had the silky elegance of Platini, the divine touch of Baggio, or the diabolical charisma of Diego. What he had was grit, fire, and something that couldn't be bought or taught, defiance. He wasn't made for posters. He was made for war. And yet, for a man who gave everything to the shirt, he wore it stained, with mud, blood, spit, and history. This is not the story of a glamorous genius. This is the story of a man who dared to stand his ground, against legends, against shame, and against the judgment of history. Because sometimes, the most powerful legacy comes from those who refused to be bowed. To understand Rudi Völler is to understand the unglamorous industrial heart of German football in the 1980s, an era of steel over style, where loyalty mattered more than flair, and where victories were forged in collective will, not individual brilliance. Born in Hanau, West Germany in 1960, Völler didn't grow up with silver spoons or youth academies wrapped in science and luxury. His early days were spent in amateur clubs, chasing loose balls on dusty pitches. He was skinny, awkward, with that wild mop of blonde curls. Nobody called him prodigy, but he had something rare. He never stopped running. By the time he reached Werder Bremen in the mid-'80s, Völler was already disrupting defenses with relentless pressing, gutsy headers, and a knack for being in the right place at the wrong time. For defenders, at least. He wasn't elegant, but he was effective. And in Germany, that meant something. His transfer to AS Roma in 1987 opened a new chapter, one written not just in goals, but in grit. Italian defenders didn't fear him the way they feared Van Basten or Carreca, but they hated playing against him. He harassed, provoked, endured. The Roman crowd fell for him not because he danced, but because he fought. This was the football world he inhabited, one where South American artistry clashed with European pragmatism, where Maradona, at the peak of his power, led Argentina with swagger and subversion. Diego was the magician, the headline. Völler? He was the man in the margins, written off as just another German striker. Even when he made the West Germany squad for Euro '84 and the World Cups of '86 and '90, he was rarely the main attraction. But that was fine. He didn't need the spotlight to function. He needed space and war. And yet beneath that rugged surface, a storm was quietly building. By the time Italia '90 arrived, Rudi Völler wasn't just a team player. He had become a symbol, not of glory, but of endurance. Then came the group stage match against the Netherlands. Tensions were volcanic. Rijkaard, Koeman, Matthäus, Völler. The Cold War may have been thawing, but on that field, it was full-blown hostility. What happened next would stain more than just Völler's jersey. It would carve a permanent scar into his legacy and set the stage for the darkest, most iconic moment of his career. In the lead-up to the 1990 World Cup, Rudi Völler had already lived the arc of a seasoned striker. He had risen from provincial obscurity to national recognition, his goal tally speaking louder than critics who called him clumsy or unsophisticated. But he wasn't built for aesthetics. He was built for impact. And under Franz Beckenbauer, West Germany didn't need poetry. They needed soldiers. Yet the signs of strain were already there. Years of physical sacrifice were taking their toll on his body. In Rome, despite being beloved by the Curva Sud for his relentless energy and commitment, he began to suffer more frequent injuries. His knees weren't forgiving. Neither were the defenders. Every match left him bruised, but Rudi never complained. When Italia '90 kicked off, Völler wasn't the headline striker. That was Jürgen Klinsmann, younger, faster, more marketable. But Beckenbauer knew the value of the old wolf, and it showed. In the opening games, Völler was everywhere, tracking back, drawing fouls, scoring crucial goals. He wasn't graceful. He was necessary. Then came the round of 16, West Germany versus Netherlands. The political tension between the two nations still simmered beneath the surface. The Dutch saw the Germans as arrogant victors. The Germans saw the Dutch as bitter losers. It wasn't just football, it was cultural retribution. In the 22nd minute, after a tangle with Rijkaard, Völler was suddenly pulled into a moment that would define his career. Rijkaard spat into his hair. The cameras caught it. The world watched it unfold in surreal disbelief. Völler's face tightened, not in rage, but in stunned humiliation. He turned to the referee. He didn't retaliate. But moments later, after another collision, Rijkaard did it again, and this time, both men were sent off. What followed was grotesque. As they walked off the pitch together, Rijkaard grabbed Völler by the neck and spat again, right in front of the tunnel. For millions watching, it was an injustice. Völler, the victim, received the same punishment as his attacker. But what he did next earned something deeper than sympathy. It earned respect. He never made a public scene, never insulted Rijkaard. He just moved on. And when he returned in the quarterfinals, he played like a man possessed. Völler scored against Czechoslovakia. He won the penalty in the final against Argentina. He ran, bled, and fought through the tournament with the spit of shame still fresh in memory, and emerged a world champion. But something in him had changed. Despite the glory, his club form at Roma declined. He became slower, more injury-prone. The fire was still there, but the body had grown tired. And when he moved to Olympique Marseille in 1992, he was no longer the fierce talisman of West Germany. He was fading. Völler retired from international football in 1994 with 90 caps and 47 goals. But no Ballon d'Or, no fairy tale ending, just the memory of mud-stained socks and a legacy carried in bruises, not in bronze. The fall wasn't dramatic. It was slow, silent, and soaked in sweat. But the world hadn't forgotten what he endured and how he endured it. If glory is loud, dignity is often silent. And Rudi Völler, even at the height of scandal, never raised his voice. But silence doesn't mean peace. Behind closed doors, those who knew him spoke of a man deeply wounded, not by the physical toll of football, but by the emotional violence he endured on the pitch that summer night in Milan. The spitting incident with Frank Rijkaard became a symbol, an image looped endlessly across televisions and newspapers. But few asked how it felt to be reduced to a meme of disgrace when all he did was try to walk away. That night, in the dressing room, Völler reportedly sat with his head in his hands, curls still wet, not just from sweat, but from another man's contempt. Teammates tried to console him. Beckenbauer tried to downplay it. But nothing could wash away the visceral shame of being spat upon in front of millions, and then punished equally. He didn't speak of revenge, but he never forgot. Years later, when asked about Rijkaard, Völler simply said, "He apologized. We've moved on, but the cameras haven't." A response so measured, so German in its restraint, yet behind it lingered decades of unresolved humiliation. What hurt even more was the public perception. To some, Völler was still mocked as the curly one who got spat on. A figure of sympathy, not respect. For a man who prided himself on grit and quiet leadership, that label cut deeper than any defender's tackle. Then there was the pain of being constantly overshadowed. In Roma, he played under the long shadow of Francesco Graziani and then Gabriel Batistuta. In Germany, the press adored Klinsmann, idolized Matthäus, and immortalized Beckenbauer. Völler was always the next man in line, never the front page headline. And yet, he kept coming back. Even after retirement, the ghosts of that image followed him into management. In 2000, when he took over the German national team as coach, tabloids resurfaced the footage again. The Spitfighter returns. No mention of his tactical acumen, no praise for his steady leadership, just recycled humiliation. He led Germany to the World Cup final in 2002 with a team few believed in. It should have been his moment of redemption. But again, he fell short, losing 2-0 to Brazil. What haunted Völler wasn't just one act. It was the feeling that, no matter what he achieved, the world remembered him for the wrong moment. And still, he never lashed out. Privately, former teammates said Völler struggled with depression in the early 90s. The decline in form, the injuries, the constant reminder of his public humiliation, it all wore him down. In an era before mental health was even a whisper in football, he bore his burden alone. He once said in an interview, "I never wanted to be a star. I just wanted to be respected." The tragedy is, respect came late, delayed by a world obsessed with drama, not dignity. Perhaps the darkest truth of all is this: it's easier to be remembered for being spat on than for standing tall. Let's be honest, Rudi Völler was never meant to be a legend in the traditional sense. He wasn't a footballing artist. He didn't glide across the pitch or dazzle with stepovers. He couldn't charm the media like Cantona or hypnotize defenders like Maradona. He was messy, unpolished, and sometimes even clumsy. But maybe that's exactly why he matters. In a sport too often obsessed with perfection, Völler was the reminder that greatness doesn't always shine. It bleeds, it grinds, it grows calluses, and sometimes it walks off the field with spit in its hair and pride still intact. As a channel that celebrates the flawed, the forgotten, and the misunderstood, we can't help but ask, why is it that some players are remembered for their mistakes while others are forgiven everything? Why did Völler, who lifted a World Cup, scored nearly 50 goals for his country, and carried his club teams through hell, end up remembered more for being a victim than a champion? Maybe because Völler was never interested in controlling the narrative. He didn't sell himself. He didn't write autobiographies with ghostwriters feeding scandal. He didn't beg for attention or shape his image. He just played. He just endured. But football isn't fair. The system celebrates the loudest, not the most loyal. It forgives the flamboyant, but punishes the modest. If Völler had kicked back, screamed into the cameras, or made enemies, perhaps he'd have his statue by now. But he chose dignity. So what do we make of him? A wasted genius? No, because he was never about genius. A victim of a brutal system? In part, yes. But also, a man who refused to be broken by that system. He reminds us of the quiet warriors, the ones who don't fit the mold, who carry their wounds privately, and who rise anyway. The question we pose to you, the viewers, did we underestimate Rudi Völler simply because he didn't sparkle? Or do we now realize that maybe, just maybe, he stood taller than most, even when covered in disgrace? He never bowed. Not to Diego, not to Rijkaard, not to the world. There's something haunting about the way Rudi Völler is remembered. Not with thunderous applause, not with golden statues or endless documentaries, but with a grainy replay of a man being spat on, standing still, and walking away. But dig deeper, and what you find is not humiliation, it's heroism. For every fan who cheered for elegance, there were those who loved the fight. And Völler was their symbol, a man who never begged for love, but earned it anyway. In Germany, they called him Tante Käthe affectionately, a nickname that sounded more like a joke than honor. But it was theirs, and it was his. To Roma fans, he wasn't just a player. He was Roman in spirit, fierce, emotional, loyal to the core. Even today, echoes of his name rise from the stands like an old war song. They never forgot. Not the goals, not the passion, not the dirt on his knees. And maybe that's his legacy. In an era defined by polished icons and media-trained brilliance, Völler was wonderfully flawed. A reminder that football was once a game of sweat, not filters, of loyalty, not branding, of men who didn't need to shine to matter. He returned to German football not for glory, but to give back. As manager, sporting director, and voice of reason during chaotic times, he anchored the sport with the same honesty that once anchored his game. He gave Germany a World Cup final as coach. He helped build the backbone of the 2014 champions. Always behind the curtain, always necessary. So when the curtain finally falls on his story, don't just remember the spit. Remember the man who didn't flinch. The man with the dirty shirt who cleaned up the mess others left behind. Some players are born to be adored. Others, like Rudi Völler, are born to be respected. And respect is what lasts. He's gone from the field, but never from memory. Because some shirts, no matter how dirty, are worn with honor.